Hello and welcome to this programming tutorial. In today's tutorial, I'm going to teach you about a new control structure called iteration, specifically count-controlled and preconditioned iteration. Now, as you see on the screen, the word iteration means to repeat. This is very useful because we can repeat code again and again as many times as we want. It shortens the amount of code that you write if you use it correctly. Let's start by looking at precondition iteration. This is one toolkit, and it's also known as a while loop. A precondition iteration is an iteration where the exit condition, in other words, the reason it stops, is always checked before the code inside is executed. In other words, it checks a condition before it runs the code. Let's look at how we write this. We start with a while command and then a condition like our selection statements. In this case, let's create a variable that is set to 50. We'll call it x. I will say while x is less than 100. Notice the formatting is very similar to if statements. Commands, condition, colon, and indentation. What we're going to do is we're going to print hello world. And actually, let's turn this into an F string and also include X, so we can see X in our outputs. Pause the video and tell me what you think the output for this program will be. Let's see what happens. As you can see, we end up with what's called an infinite loop. X is always 50 and it's repeating forever. To stop our program, if you ever encounter this, hold down the control key and press C. That will interrupt the program, just in case you have an infinite loop. So what's happened here is we've had x which is always 50, and our condition is always true. This means this code inside here will repeat forever. What we need to do is we need to adjust the variable, so eventually this condition will be false. Let's do x plus equals 1 to add 1 to our x variable every single time it repeats. Remember, this is the same as doing x equals x plus 1. It's just a shortcut. If I now run my program, we've got a bit of a change here. First and foremost, the program has stopped. But look at the additions here. 50, 51, 52, 53, it's adding to x every single repetition until this condition is no longer true. This is what a precondition iteration is. It has a condition it checks before it runs the code, and as long as that condition is true, it will repeat that code forever. Let's comment this out. I'm going to highlight it, hold down the control key, and press /. Now let's look at the other condition, count-controlled iteration. In other words, a for loop. Count-controlled iteration is an iteration that repeats a specific task a predetermined number of times based on a counter or index variable. Let's look at how we can create this. You start by writing for, and then you have to create a variable within the same line as the for loop. This makes it quite different from other stuff that we're used to. So let's create a variable. In this case, let's use the same example as before. We'll create x. And then we're going to specify what the range that x is going to go to. So let's do in range over here. Notice this is purple because it's part of the for loop. This is blue because this is a function. Range will allow you to define a range between two numbers. We're going to use this to define how many times this should repeat. If I open the brackets over here, because range is a subroutine, much like print or input, we can use 3 parameters here. The first parameter is a starting position. The second parameter tells us what number to stop at, or it tells us how many times it should repeat. So let's do number of repetitions. The third parameter is the step counter. In other words, how much to add to x every time it repeats. And lastly, we finish with a colon. Right, let's change these variables. Let's start x at 0. We're going to keep repeating 100 times, and every time we are going to repeat this for loop, we're going to add 1 to x. So x will start at 0. Every time it repeats, it will add 1 to it, and it will keep doing that until x is 100. Let's just test this. We'll print x inside the for loop. And there we go. X starts at 0, and it keeps adding 1 until it gets to 99. That means it's repeated a total of 100 times. Let's modify this now. Let's change x to a different variable. Let's call it counter. I'll change it in here as well, and this will just demonstrate to you that this is just a variable. We're going to start it at 50. It's going to go to 100, but we're going to jump by 2 every time. Now look what happens. X starts at 50, and then every time it repeats, it adds 2 to itself until eventually it gets to 98. It stops here because after 98, we add 2 and we end up with 100, which is where our condition is met. Let's do the same thing, but we're going to do 3 this time. Notice we get an even shorter list. It's adding 3 to x every time. And it stops at 98 because after 98 we get to 101, and that surpassed our condition. Now there's a couple of ways you can modify this. You don't have to have a step variable here. If you don't have a step variable, the for loop will automatically just add 1 every single time. You don't have to have a starting variable either. If you omit the starting variable and you just have 100 here as an example, the variable will automatically start at 0. So keep in mind, if you just have 100 here, it'll automatically start at 0 and go up by 1 until it gets to 100. If you have 2 variables here, you are specifying the start position and how many times it repeats. Let's run this program. There we go. And for the last variable, we can specify a step counter to see how many times it steps. So start variable, the number it goes up to, and how much it adds. This is how a for loop is different from a while loop. Thank you for watching this tutorial. I hope you found it helpful.